Hi, I'm Jen Filla.
At ease.
All right. I'm Jen Filla. I am the chairperson of the Next Steps Task Force. And just to give you all an idea of who else besides myself is on this task force, I'm going to ask everybody who's on the task force here to stand up because there's quite a few here. So y'all can see we have a nice broad spectrum on the task force. So we thought that with all of the information, with the importance of the decision that's ahead of us, most likely after General Conference, what we needed to do more than anything was just educate ourselves because it's an individual vote that gets taken. So I'm real happy to see as many of you here as are here. It's a really great turnout. And tonight we're covering basically Methodism 101. And so I am not the person to teach that one. So I'm going to turn this one over to Pastor Bob.
Thank you. Let's pray before we get going. We thank you, God, for this time, and we ask that you would bless us and give us your wisdom as we move forward through this process. In the name of Christ, amen. So I was going to make handouts, but the copier doesn't like me, so it does not operate in my presence. I think I have some kind of magnetic field, so but the video and handouts will be uploaded to the website probably by tomorrow, so you can go on there and grab them. So you don't have to write everything down furiously. It'll be available to you in the very, very short term. Tonight, what we're going to do is kind of cover where we've been and what brings us to this point, so that you're up to the minute about what's happening in the United Methodist Church. We're going to start with John Wesley, and we're going to go all the way to the present. And we're going to do it in a very rapid fashion because I know that we're already in the first quarter. So I'm fully aware of that. I know what's happening. So we're going to continue to go and march in that direction. Okay. No spoilers. All right. The Tigers are ahead. Yeah. Okay. So, as you know, I mean, I am a historian. That's sort of my orientation toward life. So for me, everything is about history, knowing where you've been, so you know where you are, and you might know where you're going. And so the history of the United Methodist Church is important for us to understand what's happening in this situation. So what I want you to see tonight, and this is the part that's missing in the news media. And by the way, if you're watching CBS or local news, or you're reading in the New York Times or things like that, you're not going to get an accurate picture because they don't understand our polity. Do you even know what the word polity means? It's the root of politics. It's our structure and rules and governance. Okay, so there's a word for your vocabulary this evening. What's that? Yeah, so, well, the best source for news is United Methodist News Service. We had a reporter come down a week ago Sunday from Denver. It was clear not only did he not know about United Methodism, but he didn't really know anything about religion in general. So they really can't. They called us the Methodist religion, for example. So okay, didn't realize we'd started our own religion, but there it is. And so what we're going to do is kind of give you the most accurate picture I think I can give you, and then. If you have questions, we've got some note cards and pens on the tables. That'll help us facilitate and expedite the process a little bit. If you have questions, write them down, and then we'll gather them up at the end. I'm going to try to wrap up a little bit before 7:30 so we can take the last half hour for questions. And you can always email me other questions as we go along, or ask anybody on the task force what's going on. So what we're seeing, I think, in the United Methodist Church is not merely conflict over human sexuality. That's the presenting issue. That's the one that's going to get all the press. But I'm going to argue tonight, along with many other church historians, that the conflict we're seeing has been embedded in the United Methodist Church since its inception in 1968. And so we're finally now recognizing that the differences are not sustainable. 1968 was a great kumbaya moment. You know, if you know what was going on in the country at the time, There was an ecumenical movement going on, which I'll talk about here in a minute. But we're at a crossroads where that history now has led us to a place where the big tent cannot hold up anymore. So let's talk about Methodism pre-1968. John Wesley established, he and his brother Charles began the Methodist movement in Oxford in the early 18th century. And Methodism grew throughout England, as you know, grew to be sort of a life-changing, culture-changing event in England. It came to America in the mid-18th century with Francis Asbury and Thomas Coke, the first two Methodist bishops, quickly became the largest non-Anglican denomination in the colonies, and survived through the American Revolution when all things British were not very popular, as you might imagine. Francis Asbury kind of kept his head down. John Wesley wrote some things that were anti-revolution because he was a Tory at heart, and yet Methodism flourished after the Revolutionary War through the 19th century. Now, at the same time, you had this English brand of Methodism. You also had a German pietistic brand of Methodism that was going on at the same time. With people like Philip William Otterbein and others who had begun a strain of Methodism that kind of came out of the Moravian connection. So you have German pietists, you have British ex-Anglicans / Methodists, both operating under the same kind of tutelage of John Wesley, but not quite together at that point. Now, in the 19th century, the Methodist Episcopal Church, as it was known, split over the issue of slavery. It split into the creative names of Methodist Episcopal Church North, Methodist Episcopal Church South. And also what you have going on in the 19th century is a post-Enlightenment kind of shift theologically. It begins in Germany with a lot of focus on historical critical method applied to the scriptures. So you had a lot of enlightened skepticism about the scriptures. You had a lot of medical advancement, scientific advancement going on in the 19th century. So this idea of the sacred and secular begins to split even more. Even biblical theology, things like that, becomes a lot more liberal on that side of the house. At the same time, here in America, it's becoming more evangelical. So you have these two different strains of Protestantism that have kind of begun to diverge already in the 19th century. And I'm not just talking about in Methodism, I'm talking sort of universally. The 20th century saw the reunion of the Methodist Episcopal Church coming back together finally in 1939 after healing over the breach of slavery, and there was a desire to reconnect these divergent streams of Methodism. And so when you get into the mid-20th century, now you have this idea of ecumenical movements, and you see the establishment of bodies like the Federal Council of Churches, the World Council of Churches, the National Council of Churches. And you saw a lot of unions and mergers between different denominations. The ME North and South, as I said, 1939. From the German side, the Evangelical Church and the United Brethren Church formed the Evangelical United Brethren Church. And there are places around the country where you can see the two different aspects of Methodism. Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania, there were five, I don't know if there still are, but there were 5 Methodist churches in Mechanicsburg, all within about a mile of one another. And there the twain shall meet, because these were the old EUBs and these were the old Methodists. And there was a lot of friction between them, but both denominations kind of struggling a bit. So 1968, in this driving spirit, a quest for unity, a quest to create a big tent church, they came together. And the dominant issues were church structures, how to merge different understandings and practices regarding ordination, bishops, clergy deployment, etc. So you can imagine you've got different ideas about what a denomination is and what it has been. Now you're going to try to bring those two things together. And that's not an easy task. So you have a merger also of a large membership church. The Methodist Church had about 10 million members in 1968, whereas the EUB had about 750,000 members. And the question was, what is our coherent identity going to be? How are we going to be structured? What is the thing that brings us together? Primarily, around doctrinal issues and moral standards. What does that look like? How do you do when you have two different theological streams? How do you bring those together? So they did what Methodists do. They created a study commission to present to the first post-merger General Conference in 1972. Now, behind the scenes of all this, 1968 and the early 70s, a lot of us in this room lived through that time, though I was pretty little. Thanks be to God. But I remember seeing it on TV while I was watching Roadrunner and Bugs Bunny and all that. Vietnam, the Vietnam War was at its height. 68 was the Tet Offensive. You had student protests going on in the United States about the Vietnam War. The Civil Rights Movement, the sexual revolution is taking place at this time. You have the troubles in Ireland between Catholics and Protestants. You have the assassinations of Robert Kennedy, and you have the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., the Cold War, the Soviets take over Czechoslovakia. In 1968, we think we're in a conflicted time now. 68 was really out there. So some of you who remember that well, remember that it was even crazier back then. We just didn't have the internet. Imagine if they had the internet in 1968. Wow. So at the same time, you see these two divergent streams of Protestantism that have been at play in the United States through the 19th century, through the 20th century, also begin to emerge, and two different visions begin to emerge. You have the rise of Protestant liberalism, which grows out of that 19th century skepticism, and you have the evangelical movement. Remember, this is sort of the height of Billy Graham's work, that launching of the evangelical kind of church. Now, that's capital E evangelical, small e, we're all evangelical in some sense, because if we're Christians, we're spreading the word of Christ, right? But that word's sort of become greasy over time, and we have to make sure we use it properly. But you also have the Jesus People movement. You have a real sort of focus in Protestantism around getting back to Scripture, things like that. So these two divergent streams are still present. Now, they're still present when the 1972 General Conference happens. And I'm going to talk more about this at the next session. But General Conference is the only body that speaks for the entire United Methodist Church. It consists of a body of elected delegates from United Methodist churches around the world that gather every 4 years, about 800 plus people, to make decisions that are placed in our book of discipline. Right? So bishops don't dictate what is and what isn't. Only the General Conference can make decisions for the church, which is why it's such a big event. So what they decided to do in 1972 with these divergent streams was not to come up with a new set of doctrinal standards that would unite these two bodies, but rather they simply incorporated both the Methodist and the EUB doctrinal standards side by side without any change. So if you look in our book of discipline today, you really have two different doctrinal statements. They're similar in a lot of ways, but they're two different ones, the Old Methodist and the Old EUB. Plus you have the Articles of Religion that Wesley took from the Anglicans. You have Wesley's sermons, Wesley's notes on the Old and New Testament. Those are all part of our doctrinal standards. Interestingly, not the creeds were not part of our doctrinal standards at that point. And the theological statement that they came up with, the unifying thing that they came up with, was not a specific doctrinal commitment, but rather they embraced pluralism openly, which meant that many theological expressions and experimentation were allowed to take place within that Methodist umbrella. So you have all kinds of different theologies emerging as they're emerging in the 1960s. Feminist theology, liberation theology, process theology. You begin to see the rise of other movements like the Jesus Seminar, which really comes into play in the 90s, but the seeds of it are kind of planted in this 1970s period, which basically take the Gospels and say, Jesus didn't do any of the miraculous stuff. We know that because that stuff doesn't happen. Probably didn't rise from the dead. So therefore, we need to readjust the gospel down, and we're going to have a social justice gospel as opposed to and so you have one side with a social justice gospel, you have the other side with a personal salvation gospel. And that's when I always quote E. Stanley Jones, who said something like, you need both. A social gospel without a personal gospel is a body without a soul, and a personal gospel without a social gospel is a soul without a body. One is a corpse, the other one's a ghost, right? So I think you got to keep that in mind as you think about these things. So this begins now to happen within the new United Methodist Church. You have these two divergent streams of Christianity, both trying to kind of come to the forefront in the midst of this formation of the denomination. And that begins to develop what we might call caucus Methodism. That lots of different interest groups arise defending different aspects of this theological big tent. And a few years earlier, 1964, Albert Outler, who was a prominent Methodist theologian, taught at Perkins Seminary in Dallas, developed, based on Wesley's writing, what he believed and what he called the Wesleyan quadrilateral, which put scripture, tradition, reason, and experience almost on equal planes. He recognized scripture was primary, but he brought the other ones in together so that it formed a quadrilateral, which meant all these things are to be taken equally. Now, later in his life, before his death, Albert Outler said this was the greatest mistake he ever made in his life, because what he had done was essentially downplayed the primacy of Scripture and laid into this now it's open season. You know, which side of this quadrilateral do you tend to gravitate toward? Those on the evangelical side of the house tend to gravitate toward Scripture. Those on the more liberal Protestant side of the house gravitated toward experience. Reason and tradition, all interpretive. So here again, it doesn't heal the divide. It simply embeds the process for it to become more of a problem later. Also in 1972, you have the insertion into the Book of Discipline in response to the sexual revolution, language about homosexual practice, that the practice of homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching. That was embedded in 1972 at this conference. Obviously, not uncontroversial, okay? So, and that's been there since. It's had different sorts of definitions and things added to it, but that's when it has been embedded since 1972. So in effect, what we see is that the roots of this conflict were present from the very inception of the United Methodist Church. The UMC looked more like a big tent political party holding together all these various constituencies rather than a church with core convictions and a common mission. That's two different visions. We still hear those today. If you're paying attention to any of the rhetoric that's going on from each side, one side is talking about fidelity to the scriptures, the other one's talking about a big tent where everybody can live. And so the question then becomes, how do you maintain a church in which everyone disagrees with everyone else? Like someone said, whenever you have two Methodists together, you get three opinions, right? So, and a potluck. So you know, you've got this divergent idea, and so and plus it's sort of like, you also see from the very beginning, United Methodism has never grown. Since the date of its inception, it has never gained membership. It has always been in decline. So you have basically the Titanic now floating. It's bumped into the iceberg. It's taken on water. And you have all these different captains now fighting for the wheel rather than figuring out, I'm going to use a lot of metaphors tonight, so work with me here, okay? But I think that's pretty accurate. You know, there was never, because of all this internal sort of who are we and what are we about, there's just been a struggle to see what's the vision to go forward. And you also have the cultural wind that's blowing against this big tent the entire time, starting in 1968. If you could have thought of a more tumultuous year to start something like this, that was the year to do it. And throughout the 70s, 80s, 90s, different cultural winds have blown, and the church has blown with it in many ways. In 1988, though, there was a reassessment of the theological statement. People said, this isn't really working. And at this time, the more conservative side of the church was rising up a little bit more. And so there was an adoption of a new theological statement that expunged theological pluralism and re-emphasized our Wesleyan heritage around the primacy of Scripture. But so many people had lived under the 1972 discipline for 16 years that they operated under this pluralistic vision. It had become embedded in the church. Most United Methodist seminaries, many bishops and clergy educated in those seminaries, adopted that more liberal vision of Protestantism, and therefore you see this conflict beginning to take place. Even though you make statements, even though you can vote on things at General Conference, and I will tell you that from the very beginning, votes on these things have always been about 54 to 46. Because we're a global church, and because that includes Africa, where the church has grown. It hasn't grown in the United States. United Methodism has declined, but in Africa, it's taken off exponentially. So 88 also reaffirmed the statement that the practice of homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching, and you had subsequent conferences every 4 years, and now you're in a place where my memory of the United Methodist Church comes. It's added additional prohibitions against same-sex marriage and the ordination of practicing homosexuals, and yet the pluralistic vision side of the house rejects those statements. So, late 20th century, it really starts to heat up. I can tell you that I was ordained a deacon in 94. And it was not apparent to me when I was going through seminary, but when I first got to my first appointment and went to annual conference, that you began to see how this was starting to play out. You have conflict ramping up with different visions digging in. You have regional differences really beginning to develop in United Methodism. So, for example, if you live in the Southeast, Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, places like that, that's a much more traditional conservative area as you might expect. If you live here in the West, however, the dominant vision is liberal progressive, theologically, socially, and so forth. So different areas of the country, and because of the way that General Conference is broken out, you get the number of delegates from your annual conference, your region, based on your membership. So there are more United Methodists in North Georgia Conference than there are in the entire United States, the Western United States, from Kansas to Hawaii and Alaska and north and south to the borders. So that gives you some idea of scale, right? Our annual conference, which comprises 4 states, Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, Montana, and one church in Idaho, has about 30,000 United Methodists on the books. It's not worship attendance, that's membership, which is fractional, right? So there's a lot of regionalism. Africa continues to grow. They will be 32% of the delegates in 2020, which is a significant chunk, and that chunk would continue to grow. But so you have that going on. You have caucuses going on. There are conflicts over LGBTQ issues, abortion, other political issues. Whatever happens in the culture happens in the church. So every time there's an election cycle, people like to say things like, well, George W. Bush and Hillary Rodham Clinton are both United Methodists. Isn't it great that we live in this big tent? Maybe it is. But also you see 2 very different visions in the midst of that. So you've got that going on. You've got most of the boards and agencies of the church, which skew progressive. The leadership skews progressive. The 13 United Methodist seminaries tend to be more liberal in their approach. Those are the official seminaries. So you've got this divide that's taking place. Sort of the liberal progressive side sort of taking over the power structure, the traditional side wanting to do that, but fighting to hold on and to keep the majority at General Conference. So you have a conservative majority at General Conference, a progressive majority the rest of the time. Does that paint the picture for you? Yeah. So it's like Congress, okay? So what's happening then, as of the late 20th century, is that the provisions of the discipline, particularly around sexuality issues, are not enforced in many segments of the church. So out west here, for example, non-enforcement of the discipline around human sexuality is not a new thing. It didn't start in 2016. It didn't start in 2019. It's been going on since the beginning. But you also have the rise of rise of evangelical Methodism in the global South. So this you can see the storm. It's all gathering at this point. And then the storm begins to break. Conflict comes to a head. The key question then is which vision is going to prevail? And everybody's fought for this for so long. Will we be a mainline church that's institutional in nature, pluralistic theologically, or will we be, and I'm using the term Methodist here, not suggesting that those who are mainline are not Methodist, but those on the other side of the house who are evangelically Methodist, who really dive deep into doctrine, specificity around those kinds of things, and are doctrinally focused. Which vision of the church will prevail? That's the constant battle. That's the wrestling over the wheel of the Titanic. Okay. So General Conference from the late 20th century to the present have been focused on the conflict between these two visions. The big issue is human sexuality. That's the presenting issue. But to use the iceberg metaphor, it's only the part that sticks up above the surface. There's a lot of other stuff underneath. When you talk about things like how do you envision, what is the role of the Bible in making ethical decisions? Is it something we consult but see as a historic document, or is it the living Word of God? People have different visions about that. What do we believe about human beings? What do we believe about atonement and salvation and all those kinds of things? Do we believe in the exclusivity of Christianity as the only way to come to God, or do we believe that there are many different paths, this is just one? These are the kind of conflicts that we see. So it's much more than just human sexuality. The media will play that because that is the presenting issue, but it goes much deeper than that. I want to make sure I emphasize that. Not that it's unimportant, it is hugely important, but it does go a lot deeper. So in 2004, as early as 2004, there was a proposal to say these two visions are not compatible with one another. We keep battling this out. Reverend Bill Hinson of the confessing movement, which was one of those conservative caucuses, suggested that the UMC is not sustainable in its current mode. It's already declining. So in order to reverse the decline, we may need to separate in order to pursue these different visions with gusto and allow God to do what he would do. But that was widely rejected by institutionally focused United Methodists. The flea does not vote the dog off the island. Okay, that doesn't work. If you're a bishop and you're elected bishop for life, you're going to do everything you can to sustain this. A lot of people sustain it. Guaranteed appointments, all the money that's invested in boards and agencies, all that kind of stuff plays into this. And so there were affirmations of unity while continuing the battle. We are the United Methodist Church. We are united. Come with me to annual conference sometime. So why has breaking up been so hard to do? There are a number of reasons. One is the trust clause. Tri-Lakes United Methodist Church, established 1991, built this building 2006. Some of the people in this room invested a lot of hard work and a lot of capital to build this church. We still owe about $1.3 million on it. It is a gift. But I don't know if you know this, you don't own the building. The annual conference owns the building in trust. Even though the annual conference did not give a dime for the construction of the church, they own it in trust. Originally, the trust clause was put in by John Wesley back in the 18th century as a way of making sure that doctrinal conformity took place, that everybody was preaching the same thing. Otherwise, he could take the church back from one that was trying to be rogue. Imagine what he thinks now. It's kind of interesting to think about. That was the vision. Now it becomes sort of an albatross that keeps us locked in battle. So churches cannot simply leave the UMC without penalty or payment according to the current discipline. You can't just take a vote and say, we're out, we're done, see ya. You'd have to legally surrender the property. They could change the locks, seize all the assets. That includes the assets of the church, the financial assets, these microphones, everything. That is part of our discipline. And you also have apportionments, this requirement for connectional giving of a percentage of the church income. We've talked about that before. And appointments, which is unique to Methodism. There aren't too many denominations that do this, but that clergy are assigned to churches. I mean, who was on SPR when I came? 50 years ago, it feels. So like 10 years ago. Mark was on SPR. So Mark will tell you what the process is. It's not like we're going to interview the new pastor. Yeah, but you had to make a decision within a 2-hour window, right? And we had to make a decision. They take you and put you in a different room, and they put the SPR in a different room after you had a chance to meet. And you talk about it, say, well, does this look good? Does it look good to you? Well, it's going to happen because you have to come up with a compelling reason not to. It's a done deal when you walk in the door. So the appointment system, and all clergy are guaranteed an appointment in the United Methodist Church. Does that sound like tenure? It is. Okay. So there is that aspect of it. So what you have is an institutional connectional system that it's made it virtually impossible to stop the conflict because the combatants are locked in battle in a system that cannot let any of them go without it costing an arm and a leg. The image I use a lot, this is a Bob Kaler original, so you can disregard it if you want. If you took a cobra and a mongoose and you put them in a burlap sack and tied it shut and threw it in the river, one of them is going to win the battle, but both of them are going to drown. And that's what our system has done to us. So, 2016, critical year, conflict comes to a breaking point. Resistance to the United Methodist Book of Discipline ramps up. Several progressive bishops and clergy conduct same-sex weddings. They do it publicly as a protest against the Book of Discipline. Conferences begin ordaining non-celibate gay clergy in defiance of the discipline. At the 2016 General Conference, the slight traditional majority backed by the Africans was about to vote more restrictive language into the discipline. At that point, there was a coalition of people who call themselves centrists, led by some of the largest church pastors in the United States, Adam Hamilton, Mike Slaughter, proposed instead that the bishops lead a way forward out of this crisis, because you got one side of the church that's resisting, you got the other side of the church trying to enforce more. What do you do about that? Bishops, lead us. That was basically the call. So what did the bishops do? They formed a committee. Called the Commission on a Way Forward, which was a 32-member panel from different constituencies to develop a plan. Now listen to this. This is critical. To maintain the unity of the church in the midst of the conflict. In other words, let's tie the bag tighter. Okay? No exit path as part of that. And so they called for a special general conference in 2019 to vote on plans put forward by the Commission on a Way Forward. So these people met, they developed 3 plans. Now, for those of you who've been S3s in the military, plans and operations, what do you have if you have 3 plans? You have no plans, okay? That's exactly what happened. So 2016, after the general conference, in addition to this committee being formed, it's going to take 2 years to do its study and come up with its work. At the same time, in July, at jurisdictional conference also happens every 4 years. That's a regional conference where several annual conferences in a particular region gather together with their delegates. Their primary focus is to elect bishops. So there was an opening for a bishop in the Western jurisdiction. And in defiance of the discipline, Karen Oliveto, who is a married lesbian, was elected bishop and subsequently assigned to the Rocky Mountain Conference, which is our conference, 2016. Same time, October of 2016, a coalition of traditional United Methodists forms the Wesleyan Covenant Association, which seeks to either reform the current United Methodist Church or, if that's not possible, to start a new traditional Methodist denomination separate from the current United Methodist Church. Full disclosure, I'm a board member of the Wesleyan Covenant Association, just to let you know that. I have not pushed our church to be part of the Wesleyan Covenant Association, however, because I want you to make a decision apart from what I think and do, okay? Because you're going to have to live with it long after I'm gone. So that brings us to the Special General Conference in St. Louis in February, where the 3 plans were brought forward, and the General Conference was primarily about these plans. We're going to vote on these plans, see which one we like. Most of the bishops and U.S. delegates came wanting to pass what's called the One Church Plan, which would have removed all the restrictive language around LGBTQ clergy and ordination and same-sex marriage from the Book of Discipline, but allow those churches who had other convictions to stay within that system. There was a connectional conference plan to divide the UMC into 2 or 3 different conferences under a general UMC umbrella. That plan would have required several constitutional amendments, which require, to change the Constitution and the discipline, you have to have a 2/3 vote by all of the annual conferences. Pretty high bar to cross, okay? So that one was pretty much dead in the water before it got started. Everybody's like, well, there's no way we can pass this. And then the third one, which came in late, was the traditional plan, which was to strengthen the current language in the United Methodist Church around human sexuality and add additional accountability measures for bishops and clergy. So, do you see the cobra and the mongoose here? They're coming to battle it out at General Conference 2019. So St. Louis, and it's fitting that the conference took place in the Edward Jones Dome where the St. Louis Rams used to play, big stadium. And it was also very prescient that we had to end exactly on time after 3 days, because the next thing that they were going to have to do was bring in a bunch of dirt and put it on the floor for a monster truck rally. So we had to get out of the way for the dirt, okay? I'll let you do all the metaphorical work you want to with that. So what was the result of the 2019 Special General Conference? Well, the One Church Plan, which was preferred by the bishops and others, did not make it through the preliminary vote. Why not? Because of African delegates and the conservative, remember that 56, 44, 53, 47 kind of margin? It's by that margin that it failed. The Central Conference Plan gained virtually no support. Nobody wanted to do that because it's too much work and too many constitutional amendments. And so what passed then with this slight majority? The traditional plan, which included more provisions for accountability in the Book of Discipline. But not all of those provisions were passed at the Special General Conference because we ran out of time. But it was moving that direction. So, as you might imagine, the cobra and the mongoose are now locked in a death grip after General Conference. Progressive annual conferences, bishops, and others declare statements of noncompliance and resistance to the Book of Discipline and the provisions of the traditional plan. Institutional United Methodists who wanted the One Church Plan join in that resistance. So that's why when you hear about centrists and progressives, that's the sort of the differentiation between the two. In the summer, U.S. annual conferences elect more progressive delegations to their regular scheduled 2020 General Conference. 2020 is the regular 4-year cycle, in hopes of overturning the traditional plan. And angst and conflict over the passing of the traditional plan causes different groups to begin seeking separation of the church and developing plans for that separation to be submitted to the 2020 General Conference. So in other words, after the 2019 General Conference, people on all sides began to realize we can't keep doing this. We can't keep fighting this out. The optics are terrible. People are getting hurt on all sides of this thing. We've got to figure out a way out of this. Not surprisingly, everybody went to their corners and began to develop their own plans for this. The Wesleyan Covenant Association, seeing the possibility of a new denomination in the future, developed a new book of doctrine and discipline for a potential new traditional Methodist denomination. I was on the writing team for that, full disclosure. Plans were also for separation were also submitted by various caucus groups as legislation for the 2020 General Conference. So you had a coalition of traditional, centrist, and progressive folks who got together, which is kind of fascinating, to develop what was called the Indianapolis Plan, which would have done a fair and amicable separation of the church. Well, fair depending on who you talk to, of course, but it was a negotiated one. It was the only one of these plans that had multi-partisan support. Same time, centrists developed the Next plan, which was essentially a plan to expel traditionalists, allow traditionalists to leave and to leave the church with some penalty upon exit. So I did maintain the unity, but let those who really want to go. And then there were several other progressive plans that would dissolve the UMC, start new denominations. The problem is, if you dissolve the United Methodist Church, now you've created a legal nightmare because of all the assets. There are a couple $1 billion worth of assets in the United Methodist Church. So what do you do with all that? What do you do with all the institutions that are connected to the United Methodist Church? How do you untangle that? So in some sense, no matter what happens, the existing United Methodist Church has to still exist in some sense after all this is done. At the same time, all these plans are being submitted, and they had to be submitted by September to be on the docket for the General Conference in 2020, because they have to be translated and then sent out in what's called the Advanced Daily Christian Advocate to all the delegates in January prior to General Conference in May. So that's why the legislation deadline is so early. But at the same time, Bishop Yambasu of Sierra Leone decides to launch his own attempt at bringing together a multi-partisan plan around this, bringing together the leaders of these various constituencies, more heavy hitters than were involved in the Indianapolis plan, to come together and try to reach mutual agreement on a single plan of separation to be presented at the 2020 General Conference that would supersede all these other plans. In other words, the idea was to go into General Conference with a mutually agreed upon plan of separation that could be voted on and executed. Okay, that's where we are now. When the news came out a week ago, people said, United Methodist Church separates. Not yet. That still needs to be voted on. So there's a lot of stuff out there about that. Now, what is this plan? Well, let me give you a brief overview of it because many people have asked about it. I think I can do this in 5 minutes. Here we go. 16 leaders from various perspectives were all brought together. These are the key decision makers for the different caucus groups. Okay, so these are people who represent lots of other people, through different connections, Ken Feinberg was asked to be the mediator for this group. And if you know anything about Ken Feinberg, he's been involved in major mediations: 9/11 Victims Fund, Deepwater Horizon. Some of the major cases of major, distribution of assets, things like that, he's involved in that. So this guy, I can't imagine what his billable hours are. I mean, probably insane. He did this pro bono. 3, he's Jewish, but he has a deep love of faith and love of people, wanting to see them be fruitful, And so he saw this as an opportunity to do some good work out of his own religious tradition to help us through this impasse. So it's pretty amazing when you think about it. You have all the major players in the room, and you have probably the one person in the country who could possibly get them to yes. I think it's a work of God, to be honest. And so out of that, a smaller subgroup met with Feinberg to hammer out the details of the agreement, which was reached on December 17th. But they waited till after Christmas to release it because all of us pastors needed more to do right after Christmas. So New Year's, boom, blow up. So what does this do? It provides for the separation of the United Methodist Church, that a post-separation United Methodist Church will continue, while also providing for the creation of a new traditional Methodist denomination, which will likely be facilitated into being by the Wesleyan Covenant Association. Other denominations, like a more progressive expression, may also emerge if they register with the Council of Bishops by May 15th, 2021. So on that centrist progressive side, there are some who are more progressive than centrists, and so there's this idea of maybe they won't be able to get together either. So it might not just be two sides to this. There might be 3 or 4 or 10 different sides to this. The post-separation United Methodist Church will modify the current discipline to fit its context, eliminate the current language concerning LGBTQ issues, remove restrictions on same-sex marriage and ordination. The traditional denomination will create its own discipline and structure, which the Wesleyan Covenant Association has already done. Our discipline's only 73 pages. It'll get bigger. But what that means is that there has to be a decision-making process now, if this passes at General Conference. Central conferences, which are our large church bodies, regional bodies in Africa, Philippines, Europe, will make decisions. Annual conferences will make decisions about where they're going to affiliate, and local churches will make decisions about where they're going to affiliate. So this becomes the great separating of the sheep and the goats, but it's self-selected, okay? So central conferences, Africa, Europe, the Philippines, requires a 2/3 vote to join the new Methodist denomination. Otherwise, they remain with the post-separation United Methodist Church. Annual conferences, if they choose not to vote, they automatically remain with the post-separation United Methodist Church. To vote to join the new traditional denomination, they have to pass that vote by 57% margin. Now, where's 57%? Where'd that come from? This was the absolute last thing that was negotiated at the absolute last hour, because the centrist progressives desperately wanted a 2/3 vote at the annual conference level. Traditional side wanted simple majority. What's the difference between 2/3 and simple majority? 57%. Feinberg said, boom, there it is. And everybody went, okay, I guess we'll deal with that. He said, there was a briefing this morning and Feinberg was talking about this, and he said, I considered a successful negotiation because no one is absolutely happy about it. You know, that's the sign of a good negotiation. At the local church level, the church council will determine whether to hold a vote, first of all, and if they choose to hold a vote to join a new traditional denomination, whether that vote will be at a 2/3 threshold or a simple majority threshold. So that's the choice that a local church has. If they choose to take a vote, they'll have to let the district superintendent know and take that vote within 60 days of the church council's decision to hold a vote. And the district superintendent then will come and facilitate a church conference where all of the professing full members of the church will have a vote on where they affiliate. If you choose not to vote, you automatically stay with the post-separation United Methodist Church. You only have to vote if you're thinking about jumping ship. Or as the famous philosopher just passed away last week, Neil Peart, the drummer of Rush, said in one of his lyrics, if you choose not to decide, you still have made a choice. So what this means is, here's the kicker. Local churches who join the new traditional Methodist denomination, or if they choose a progressive denomination that might emerge out of this, they will retain all of their property and assets free and clear. There's no mechanism to enforce back payment of apportionments. And they're expected to meet connectional responsibilities up to that date. No additional apportionments or pension liability payments will be required upon separation other than previously documented loans from the annual conference. There was an exit provision passed at the 2019 General Conference, but it was expensive. It would have required churches to pay 2 years worth of apportionments and their section of the conference's unfunded pension liability. To give you an idea what that is, because I asked, for us at Tri-Lakes, that would have meant we pay about $115,000 to $120,000 in apportionments each year. So think $240,000 just in apportionments. Our section of the unfunded pension liability would have been $325,000. So you're talking about, in that plan, it would have been a buyout of close to $600,000. Not really doable. This eliminates all that. And if you choose to go, you go with all your stuff. If a church chooses to close, property will be subject to a lien in favor of Westpath, which is our pension board, for payment of future unfunded pension liabilities. In effect, in this plan, rather than you paying your unfunded pension liabilities up front, the traditional United Methodist denomination will also use Westpath as their pension minder. So if you're a clergy person and you migrate over to the new denomination, you keep your pension and you're still paying into it in the new denomination. So nobody loses their pension. That's a major pin back in the grenade, okay? Churches who disaffiliate but do not join one of the new denominations created by this protocol will be subject to the discipline, and they'll have to pay all their unfunded pension liabilities and apportionment. So if you decided you wanted to be an independent church, you're going to whip out the checkbook. It's about sorting people into new denominations, not simply breaking into independent churches. Property belonging to annual jurisdictional and central conferences will be retained by those entities regardless of affiliations. Wherever they vote to go, that's where their property goes. So like the conference office in Denver, stuff like that. A total sum of $25 million will be paid by the General Council on Finance and Administration to the new traditional Methodist denomination over the ensuing quadrennium. There's a lot of formulaic stuff around where they arrived at that figure. Quadrennium is 4 years. 4 years. Another new word you learned tonight. Polity and quadrennium. Use those tomorrow in a sentence and blow people's minds, okay? So over 4 years, that $25 million will be paid to the traditional denomination for its initial operating costs. And that was a complex negotiation around liquid assets and things like that I don't want to get into too much. You can look at the documents and get all of that. Another $2 million set aside for any other potential Methodist denomination emerging out of the protocol. $39 million set aside over the next 2 quadrennia, 8 years, to fund ministries for and by Asian, Black, Hispanic, Latino, Native American, and Pacific Islander communities, to continue the ethnic ministries that are already going on, and also to fund Africa University so that there's no delay in funding for them. Pension remains in place. Westpath will be the administrator for the pension funds for everyone. There's also some immediate effect of the protocol even before it gets voted on, and that is 2 moratoriums that are embedded in the agreement. One is that all administrative or judicial processes addressing restrictions in the discipline regarding same-sex weddings and ordination of LGBTQ persons shall be held in abeyance effective January 1, so effective a couple weeks ago. What that means is that any charges that have been filed, any trials that are taking place around LGBTQ, same-sex marriage, ordination, things like that, all of that is suspended for now, while this is coming to the forefront. At the same time, closure of churches is also delayed, because what was happening was there were some bishops who were seeing churches that might leave the current denomination, and they were saying those churches were no longer viable. The bishop said the church is no longer viable, close the church, seize the assets before they leave. So this shuts that window off as well. So 2 moratoriums in the midst of that. So what are the next steps? Well, there's a lot of washing that has to take place for this stuff as it gets through the legislative process. The first process is writing the legislation. And that's being done by a subset of this team that was negotiated. And they're using the parameters of the agreement to write the legislation. That legislation will have to be brought before the General Conference by the vote of an annual conference and special session, since it is being submitted after the September deadline. Does that make any sense? So like an annual conference has to get together, vote this through so that it can go on to General Conference. Otherwise, it has to be brought from the floor, which is a little bit more difficult process. Council of Bishops then has requested our Judicial Council, which is our Supreme Court, to make a declaratory decision on the constitutionality of this protocol. In 2012, we spent 2 weeks voting on a plan to streamline the church's structure, had the agreement in place, actually voted on it and passed it. I was sitting in the airport ready to fly home. I'd left just a little bit early when I get a text on my phone saying Judicial Council said all of it's unconstitutional. Every bit of work we did for 2 weeks flushed down the drain. $9 million for annual conference, General Conference. So this is to avoid that. Let the Judicial Council look at it first, okay? There also has to be a financial impact done by the General Council on Finance and Administration. The Council of Bishops then is going to work with the Commission on General Conference, which sets the agenda, to make this protocol the first order of business at the 2020 General Conference. Because obviously, if you pass this, then all the other stuff is moot. And then they drop the gavel. You split into two different groups. The post-separation UMC starts its new General Conference. The traditional side of the church probably will not do its convening conference at that point, but plans are already in the works. So that's if all the dominoes fall in place, that's how it would work. What does this mean for us? This is the key question. If the protocol passes, the membership of the church will have the option to stay in the post-separation United Methodist Church or vote to join the new traditional Methodist denomination. Now, the questions you're going to ask are, well, what do those two look like? We don't have enough time to do that tonight. And the short answer is we don't know completely what that's going to look like. But there are pros and cons to both, and you need to know all of the parameters around those decisions as much as possible. So I want to make sure we give that the right amount of juice, okay? I'm just kind of sort of bringing you up to date on where we are. But no matter the decision that's made, there's going to be change at the denominational level. There will automatically be. The Next Steps Task Force, led by Jen, you met some of those folks, are developing a list of values that we'll use in decision making. Our church council will use those. We'll talk about those as a church. They are pretty generic. They could apply to either choice that you make, but it's a way of evaluating the process. And we'll talk about those in another future session. They've been developing various contingency plans to present to the church council. We were working on all the different plans that have been submitted to General Conference, and then this dropped, and now we're working on one plan. And what does that look like? And how do we communicate that the best? And the key is for this task force, which has a lot of different people on it, is to make sure that you have as much information as you can have to make a good decision, regardless of what that decision might be, that it's your decision, and that you can say we did everything possible to make sure everybody had a stake and a voice. That's the key part of what the commission or what the task force is doing. And that's the reason they're sponsoring these town halls. I'm only speaking at this one because I have the institutional knowledge. I'll also speak at the next one because I have the institutional knowledge about how General Conference works and doesn't work. By the way, if you can actually watch all of General Conference online. If you have been struggling with sleep issues, or you felt too good lately, I encourage you to tune in to this soul-sucking adventure we call General Conference. But it is important, and this won't have a lot of drama to it. But we're going to be sponsoring town halls. The next one we'll talk about Methodism 101. What happens at General Conference? What is the General Conference? Who gets elected? How do they get elected? What's the jurisdictional conference? What's the annual conference? We're always shocked, and this is something we learned at church conference this year, was how many of our folks don't even know when we say the words like general conference, jurisdictional conference, things like that, how those things work. So we want to make sure you have a working knowledge of Methodism when we do that, okay? And then what do we do in the meantime? Yeah, most of all, stay informed. We're recording these sessions. We're going to post them up on the website. The handouts will be posted up for each session on the website. Send them around to other people. I am stunned in my conversations with other clergy that churches are not talking about this. And when this hits, there's going to be a crisis. One of the things we decided early on was we didn't want any crisis. It's going to be tough enough making a decision, but it's harder to make a decision when you don't know what you're deciding, right? So we want to make sure we do that well. And then choose accurate news sources, as I said. United Methodist News Service is the best. National media does not understand us at all. And we also have a website, a section of our website that you can go to for all the latest news. We're posting stuff there now. It's tlumc.org/next steps. If you go to that site, you'll be able to see all the different stuff that we're posting, that we're talking about, these sessions, all that's going to be on that part of the site. Okay? I have other churches around the country who are using our One Flesh study that we did in October. I have churches all around the country that are going to use this. So I think it's important, that so if you know other churches out there where people aren't talking about this, this is a great opportunity for them to do that. I'm not going to pretend that I have no bias, right? I'm not going to pretend that, but I want this to be your decision and yours alone. And you're going to have to make a good one. And you will. You will. I'm confident of that. And I'm hopeful that no matter what decision you make, this church will stay together and maintain its strength. We're one of the strongest churches in the country. I talk to pastors all over the place that are having fragmentation. Their finances are down. We had a record year of giving this past year. Our attendance is strong. Our spirit is strong. We want to maintain that. That is the number one priority for me. I made a commitment to stay here in place, and I've asked for it continuously for the last 3 years because I want to see this place to whatever future it wants to take on. That's the shepherd's job, right? And that's what we're going to do. So, next town hall meeting, February 10th. Don't think there'll be any football games that night. We'll look at Methodism 101 and how General Conference works and stuff. Okay, questions? Throw them up here. Let me address these while we're writing them down. How will Methodist hospitals and schools be affected? The Methodist hospitals and schools, all those institutions, will go wherever their annual conference or their related body goes. So, for example, if there is a United Methodist related institution, like a hospital, it can either choose to sever its ties or it will go with wherever their body goes, they will go with them automatically. Okay. Are there enough pastors ordained, or are we losing them? That's one of the big questions that's coming out of this, because you don't know who's going to join what expression. So you're going to have probably a mismatch of pastors and congregations on both sides. maybe a surplus of one or a dearth of the other. It kind of depends. And one side's going to have more guaranteed appointment. The other side isn't. I can tell you the traditional side is probably not going to have the same guaranteed appointment. Churches will have a lot more autonomy in who they select to be their clergy. At least that's how I actually wrote that section of the new discipline. So if you want to know all about that, I can tell you about it. But yeah, that's enough said about that. What might the impact be either way on the African conference? That's still up in the air. There's one of the things that's really important to the African church is the United Methodist name and symbol. It has a lot of currency in Africa because of missionary work and things like that. I believe that part of the legislation is going to be that they'll be able to keep that with a modifier like the United Methodist Church of Africa. But don't quote me on that because I'm not certain about that. But I do think that's the aim of this, that nobody's so invested in the name they're just going to hold on to it, but rather they would be allowed to continue. And that frees them up to make a decision more freely where they don't have to. Because if you imagine if you're an African conference and you have to rebrand everything you have and you have no resources to do so, that's a nightmare. So there's probably going to be some provision for that in the legislation. Vast majority vote to go traditionalists, but I am not clear if traditionalists equal United Methodist Church. It would not be United Methodist Church. It would be, we don't know what it would be called, but it would not be under the same United Methodist umbrella. It would be a separate denomination. That was one of the key things about these plans as they were developing them was, do we have an umbrella or are these going to be two separate things? And we discovered that the umbrella was a lot harder to maintain and do. So that's one of those things. Rick. I did take Greek, but okay. If we join Wesleyan Covenant Association, do we change our name? Probably, but again, that's 4 steps down the road from where we are. So we've got time to work that out. Probably in some sense, yes. Will the Wesleyan Covenant Association have bishops and conferences? The answer is yes. Right now, the plan is that bishops will be term limited to 12 years instead of elected for life. WCA, do churches hire the pastor? In effect, yes, although the bishop has to sign off on it. And you also can't just up and fire a pastor either. That has to go through a process. Where was the other one? How do you see the Methodist social principles be useful in helping guiding the values to local decision making? That's a good question. It's something we might have to bring to the forefront as part of this process. And again, I think, when you look at the social principles, depending on your perspective, it's either good or bad. So I think what you're going to see is as this shakes out, before you make a decision, you're going to see a basic social witness from the traditional side and a basic social witness document from the centrist progressive side, and you'll be able to read those and say, okay, this more aligns with where I'd like to go, and so forth. Does that help? I don't know who asked that. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Well, it's interesting that you say that because one of the things the General Board of Church and Society is doing at this General Conference is submitting an all-new social principles document, which is, if we don't pass this, will be a dogfight of epic proportions because there's a lot of controversial language in it. So I do think it's something that each side of the church has to decide, what are our social principles going to be? And I think what's going to need to happen is each side will define those enough so that people make a decision will be able to see what the differences and similarities are. Does that make sense? I'm not sure I'm answering your question. Well, I haven't taught the social principles. They're available for people who want to read them. Yeah, which again, if you have sleep problems, but I think there's an opportunity for us to do more reflection about those things in the future for sure. But at this point, I believe that no matter which side you choose, those are going to change significantly. So from my perspective, it's better for us to know what they're going to be more than what they are. Does that make sense? Yeah. They could be. They could be. I'd have to evaluate that a little bit more. And that maybe that's something that the Next Steps Task Force can evaluate a little bit more as well. But thank you for that. Yeah, thank you. Under Africa, well, you're going to have to help me with that one. Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah, Congo, Zimbabwe, Kenya, uh, Zaire, I think, Zambia. There are a number of countries. Sub-Saharan Africa, primarily. Yeah, yeah. Lessons learned, precedents from the Episcopal and Methodist splits. Yes, that's been a big part of the discussion, because one of the reasons we engaged in this sort of process of mutual negotiation was that didn't happen in the Presbyterian and Episcopalian splits. So you had major litigation over property, assets, all those kinds of things. Those splits got really ugly. So this is an attempt to avoid doing that in the United Methodist Church. So there was a lot of lessons learned from that. So for example, when the Episcopalian split, the pastors and bishops who split from that church to form the Anglican Church North America lost their pensions and lost their buildings by and large. And there are lots of Episcopal properties sitting empty today because the diocese, refused to let them take their property with them. So we're trying to avoid all that kind of stuff with this process. How do we get close to 100% of members voting paper ballot? Well, you got to show up. And we'll do our best to make sure if and when there's a vote that everybody knows what it is, has plenty of time to ramp up to that, lots of opportunity to ask questions, lots of listening sessions, and then a vote that people will need to be present for. No proxies, no mail-ins. You'll have to be present. So we'll try to get that out as far as possible when that happens, if that happens. There's still a lot of if in the midst of this process. Something like that, yeah. Well, we'll figure it out. Yeah, we'll figure it out. Anything else before we wrap up? What? Okay. If we leave, will we have to refinance the church mortgage? Short answer, no. No. Yep. We get to pay it. Yeah. So yeah. We just refinanced it. What, 2-3 years ago? Yeah. So we have a good relationship with the bank. That will not change, regardless of what name goes on the outside. So Okay? Take a deep breath. It's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. And, you know, we will get through this together. And I'm confident that God will do what's best for his church. No matter where people find themselves, you know, there's going to be an opportunity. This is change. Change is never easy. But I do believe that this keeps us from being locked in the burlap sack and allows us to live into a new future. We can bless one another and then see what God does with it, you know. And again, there are going to be pros and cons to consider about where you might land. There's a lot of upside to staying put. There's a lot of uncertainty about doing something new, but there's also opportunity in that. So it's going to be important that you stay informed. When you're with people who are freaking out about this, calm them down, quell the rumors. Do you know we have rumor mill here? Did you know that? We do. I heard that, well, is anybody from the staff here? We were talking about this the other day. Some of the theories we've heard that people say, I heard this is all about, you know, Pastor Bob leaving and doing something. It's like, where did you get that from? Because people will hear all kinds of things and interpret them differently. So take a deep breath, pray a lot, and we will get through it. Let me close this in prayer. We thank you, God, for this time. We ask that you would grant us wisdom and peace and listening to one another as we move forward from this in the name of Christ. Amen. One thing before you go. January 25th, Saturday morning, 8:30 to noon is the leadership retreat. We call it the leadership retreat because we really encourage all of our leaders, committees to come, but it's open to everyone. And I'm especially excited about this one because Pam Engelbert, who she and her husband Lincoln have been coming to our church. They attend at 8 o'clock. I think this is a God thing. She has a PhD. She's actually Assemblies of God, ordained in the Assemblies of God, but she also has a PhD in communication. And she teaches at a seminary in Mongolia several times a year as a missionary. And she teaches a course on compassionate communication, about how to speak with one another and to hear what other people are saying, to recognize our own feelings in the midst of that. Jason and I sat with her a couple months ago where she told us about this, and I said, we have to do this as part of this process. So I want to encourage you to come on the 25th and be part of that process. I think it's going to be tremendously helpful for us going forward, not just in this, but in all of our communication. No matter where you're at, work, school, wherever you find yourself, it's going to be a tremendously helpful process. So I encourage you to come out for that because I think that's going to be a real addition to what we do. It's a Saturday morning, yeah. So skip the cartoons and come. What's that? Maybe. There'll be food. Yeah. There'll be food. There's always food. All right, well, blessings on your evening. And go Tigers.